On October 14, 1066, at 9 a.m., William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, stood at the bottom of Senlac Hill, looking up at 7,000 Saxon warriors who had just killed the last Viking invasion of England. By 6 p.m. that same day, England's king was dead with an arrow through his eye. Every major Saxon noble was a corpse, and a French-speaking bastard owned an entire kingdom. In just 9 hours, 500 years of Anglo-Saxon civilization ended, the English language would be forever changed, and every future English monarch would descend from an illegitimate Norman duke who couldn't even speak English. This is how 7,000 Normans destroyed England's entire military and political structure between breakfast and dinner on a single autumn day, accomplishing what Vikings, Romans and Scots had failed to do for centuries. William wasn't supposed to exist, let alone conquer England. Born in 1028 from Duke Robert of Normandy's affair with a tanner's daughter, a woman who prepared animal hides, the lowest of professions, he was called William the Bastard his entire life. French nobles literally refused to touch him at court. When his father died on pilgrimage when William was 7, Norman barons immediately tried to murder him. He survived 3 assassination attempts before age 15, once escaping by hiding in a peasant's cottage while assassins searched. By 20, he had killed or exiled every Norman noble who opposed him. This bastard son had learned that legitimacy came from the sword, not birthright. When Edward the Confessor of England allegedly promised him the throne, then Harold Godwinson took it instead, William decided to take what he claimed was his, with 7,000 killers at his back. King Harold Godwinson was having the worst month in English history. On September 8th, he disbanded the Fyrd militia that had been watching the south coast for William all summer. They needed to bring in the harvest, or England would starve. On September 12th, William's invasion fleet finally sailed. On September 20th, Harold learned his own brother Tostig had joined with Harold Hardrada, the most feared Viking alive, and invaded northern England with 300 longships. Harold force-marched his Huskarls, professional warriors, 250 miles north in 4 days. On September 25th, at Stamford Bridge, Harold's exhausted army annihilated the Vikings so thoroughly that only 24 of 300 ships were needed to carry survivors home. Harold Hardrada died with an arrow in his throat. Tostig was cut to pieces. Then, while still celebrating, Harold learned William had landed in the south 3 days earlier. The English army had to turn around and march 250 miles back. William brought something England had never seen, a combined arms professional army built for conquest. His 7,000 men included 2,000 mounted knights, the tanks of medieval warfare, wearing chainmail hauberks down to their knees, conical helmets with nose guards, carrying 12-foot lances and 3-foot kite shields. Another 3,000 were infantry, many from Brittany and Maine, professional soldiers who fought for pay, not feudal obligation. Most importantly, he had 2,000 archers and crossbowmen, including companies of mercenaries from across France. This wasn't a raid or seasonal campaign, but a meticulously planned invasion. William had spent 9 months building a fleet of 700 ships. He brought prefabricated wooden castles that could be assembled in days. He even had papal blessing. Pope Alexander II had declared this a holy war because Harold was an oath-breaker. God apparently favored the bastard. Harold's army that assembled on Senlac Hill on October 13th was a shadow of English military might. His elite Huskarls, perhaps 3,000 of England's greatest warriors, had marched 500 miles and fought a major battle in 2 weeks. Many were wounded from Stamford Bridge. The horses were dead or dying from exhaustion. The rest of his 7,000 men were feared, farmers and townsmen with spears and shields who had been hastily gathered as the army rushed south. Some historians estimate only half of Harold's potential army had arrived. Others were still marching. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine begged him to wait, to let William come to him, to gather full strength. But Harold, perhaps overconfident from his Viking victory, perhaps desperate to protect his family lands in Wessex that William was burning, chose to fight immediately. He would give battle with what he had. Senlac Hill, where Harold chose to make his stand, was a natural fortress rising 50 feet above the surrounding land, with steep slopes on 3 sides. The English formed their traditional shield wall along the crest, a formation that had never been broken in living memory. The Huscarls stood in the center with their 5-foot-tall kite shields locked together, massive, 2-handed Danish axes that could split a horse and rider in half, wearing chainmail equal to any Normans. The feared filled the wings with their round shields and spears, creating a wall of wood and iron, 700 yards long and several men deep. Behind them, Harold planted his twin banners, the Dragon of Wessex, and his personal fighting man standard, declaring no retreat. The position was so strong that William's scouts reportedly told him it was unassailable. William supposedly replied, "God will decide." At 9 a.m. on October 14th, trumpets sounded, and the Battle of Hastings began, with William sending his archers forward. Thousands of arrows arced uphill toward the Saxon line, but the angle was wrong. Shooting uphill reduced range and power. The Saxons raised their shields, creating a roof of overlapping wood, and most arrows struck harmlessly or flew overhead. The few Saxon archers returned fire downhill with devastating effect, their arrows finding gaps in Norman armor. William then ordered his infantry forward, Bretons on the left, Normans in the center, French and Flemings on the right. As they climbed the steep slope, the Saxons began their war chant, "Ut! Ut! Ut! Out! Out! Out!" At 20 yards, the feared hurled their spears, a deadly rain that killed hundreds. Then the lines crashed together with a sound chroniclers compared to thunder. The first Norman assault was a catastrophe. Infantry trying to climb the slope while fighting uphill were exhausted within minutes. Saxon axes destroyed Norman shields like kindling. The Huscarls' 2-handed axes were particularly terrifying. One swing could decapitate a man or cut through chainmail like cloth. The Norman left wing under Alan of Brittany broke first, streaming back down the hill in panic. As they fled, some Saxons on the right wing, against orders, broke formation to pursue. This created the day's first crisis, but also its first opportunity. William personally led his cavalry to cut off these pursuing Saxons, surrounding and slaughtering them in the valley. Perhaps 1,000 Englishmen died in minutes, but the shield wall on the hill remained unbroken. William had learned something crucial. If Saxons could be lured from their position, they could be killed. By noon, William had attempted 2 more frontal assaults, both failing with heavy casualties. Norman bodies littered the slope. Then William tried something that would change medieval warfare, organized feigned retreat. He ordered his cavalry to charge, engage briefly, then flee in apparent panic. It worked partially. Groups of feared, seeing Normans running, broke formation to pursue, despite Harold's desperate commands to hold. Each time, Norman cavalry wheeled around and butchered the isolated pursuers. But the Huscarls in the center held firm, their discipline unbreakable. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine moved along the line, killing any Saxon who tried to pursue. The shield wall, though thinning, stood strong. 3 hours into the battle, William had failed to break through anywhere. After noon, William committed his cavalry fully, 2,000 mounted knights charging uphill into the teeth of the shield wall. This was medieval warfare at its most brutal. Norman lances shattered against Saxon shields. Horses, trained war horses worth fortunes, were gutted by Saxon spears or had their heads split by axes. Knights who made it to the Saxon line found themselves facing Huscarls who specialized in killing mounted men. One technique was to duck under the horse's neck and split its skull while killing the rider with the backswing. The slope became slippery with blood and horse intestines. Wounded horses screaming and thrashing created more chaos than their riders' swords. After an hour of continuous cavalry charges, Norman losses were so severe that rumours spread William himself was dead. Around 2 p.m, disaster nearly struck the Normans. William's horse was killed under him, the second of 3 he would lose that day. As he fell, word spread through Norman ranks that the Duke was dead. The entire Norman army began to waver, some units beginning to flee. William grabbed a horse, pushed back his helmet so men could see his face, and rode along his line shouting, "Look at me, I live, and by God's help I shall conquer." Bishop Odo, his half-brother, rallied fleeing troops with a wooden club. As a churchman, he couldn't shed blood with edged weapons. This moment could have ended the invasion, but William's personal courage, the bastard who had survived assassination since childhood, turned panic back into attack. The Normans reformed and pressed forward again. By 3 p.m, the battle had become a grinding attrition. The shield wall still held, but was shrinking. Then catastrophe struck Harold. His brother Gurth, commanding the Saxon right, took a Norman lance through his chest. As he fell, his section of the line wavered. Minutes later, Leofwine on the left was struck down by Norman swords, cut nearly in half. Both of Harold's brothers died within sight of him, their household warriors dying around them in desperate last stands. The psychological blow was devastating. These weren't just commanders, but the king's own blood. Saxon morale, maintained for 6 hours of continuous combat, began to crack. The Fyrd especially, seeing their noble leaders fall, began looking over their shoulders for escape routes. Around 4 p.m, with daylight beginning to fade and the shield wall still unbroken, William ordered a tactical change that would win him England. Instead of direct fire, his archers were to shoot high, arcing arrows over the shield wall to fall on the rear ranks. This indirect fire was devastating. Saxons in the back ranks, less heavily armoured than the frontline Huscarls, began taking casualties. Men couldn't see the arrows coming until too late. More critically, leaders trying to coordinate the defence had to expose themselves. Harold himself, moving along his line to rally troops where his brothers had fallen, was vulnerable. Whether by design or chance, one of these high-arcing arrows found the King of England. The exact moment of Harold's death is history's most debated arrow shot. Norman sources say an arrow struck him in the eye, penetrating his brain. Saxon sources claim he was cut down by Norman knights later. The Bayeux tapestry shows both, a figure clutching an arrow in his eye and another being struck by cavalry. Most likely, Harold was wounded by the arrow, perhaps not mortally, but enough to incapacitate him. As word spread that the king was down, the shield wall began to dissolve. Huscarls of Harold's personal guards surrounded their wounded or dying king, fighting to the death. Norman knights, sensing victory, pressed forward with renewed fury. William reportedly sent 4 knights specifically to ensure Harold was dead. They found him, still alive or freshly dead, and mutilated his body so severely that his mistress later could only identify him by intimate body marks. With Harold dead or dying, the Battle of Hastings became a slaughter. The Huscarls around Harold's standards fought to the last man in a scene of heroic futility. These were warriors who had sworn oaths to die with their lord, and they fulfilled them. Not one survived. As they fell, the Fyrd finally broke, streaming off the hill in panic. Norman cavalry, freed from the shield wall constraint, rode down fleeing Saxons without mercy. The pursuit was so vigorous that many Normans rode into a hidden ravine called the Malfoss, Evil Ditch, where horses and riders fell to their deaths. But nothing could stop the Norman victory. By 6 p.m, as darkness fell, the entire Saxon army was dead, captured, or scattered. England had no organized military force left. In 9 hours, William the Bastard had accomplished what no foreign invader had managed since the Romans, the complete conquest of England. But the numbers tell the true story of the slaughter. Of approximately 7,000 Saxons who began the day, perhaps 4,000 were dead, including virtually every noble of fighting age. Harold's body was so mutilated that when his mother offered William its weight in gold for proper burial, he couldn't be sure which corpse was the king. The entire command structure of Anglo-Saxon England, earls, thegns, huscarls, lay dead on Senlac Hill. There was literally no one left to organize resistance. William had not just won a battle, he had decapitated a civilization. William's 7,000 Normans, who had suffered perhaps 2,000 casualties, now owned England's 2 million inhabitants. Within weeks, William marched to London, burning and pillaging until the remaining Saxon nobles, mostly churchmen and boys, surrendered and offered him the crown. On Christmas Day 1066, William the Bastard was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The coronation was so tense that when the crowd shouted acclamation, Norman guards thought it was an attack and began burning houses around the abbey. This paranoid violence would characterize Norman rule. Every Saxon noble was dispossessed, their lands given to Norman warriors. By 1070, there wasn't a single Saxon earl left in England. The Norman conquest didn't just change England's rulers, it transformed the English language itself. Norman French became the language of court, law, and nobility. Anglo-Saxon, the language of Beowulf and Alfred the Great, became the tongue of peasants. For 300 years, England's kings didn't even speak English. When the languages finally merged, English had absorbed 10,000 French words. This is why modern English has 2 words for everything: cow, Saxon, and beef, French, house, Saxon, and mansion, French, king, Saxon, and sovereign, French. The Normans didn't just conquer England's territory, they colonized its language. Every English speaker today speaks a tongue that was born from the slaughter at Hastings. William's victory at Hastings was just the beginning of English suffering. When northern England rebelled in 1069, William's response was genocide. The harrying of the north saw Norman armies systematically destroy every village, farm, and field between York and Durham. They killed every man of fighting age, slaughtered all livestock, burned all crops and seeds, and destroyed all agricultural tools. The Domesday Book, written 20 years later, recorded vast areas still waste. Contemporary chronicles estimated 100,000 died from starvation. Some resorted to cannibalism. This wasn't medieval warfare, but calculated extermination. William wanted no more English rebellions, and dead men don't rebel. The North didn't recover its pre-1066 population for 2 centuries. Within 20 years of Hastings, the Normans built over 500 castles across England, 1 every 10 miles in some regions. These weren't the wooden forts of Saxon times, but stone fortresses designed to dominate populations. Each castle could house enough Norman knights to control surrounding territories and suppress any rebellion. The Tower of London, begun immediately after Hastings, was built deliberately to intimidate Londoners, its white stone imported from France to show Norman permanence. These castles were alien impositions on the English landscape, physical reminders that England was now an occupied country. Every castle meant demolished Saxon homes, forced labor, and permanent military occupation. England became Europe's most castled kingdom because it was Europe's most resistant conquest. In 1086, 20 years after Hastings, William ordered the Domesday Book, a complete survey of his conquered kingdom. The results revealed the thoroughness of Norman dominance. Of England's land, 20% belonged directly to William, 25% to the church, controlled by Norman bishops, and 50% to just 190 Norman nobles. The entire Saxon nobility, thousands of families, owned less than 5%. The survey showed entire regions depopulated, countless villages disappeared, ancient Saxon estates carved up among Norman warriors. It was bureaucratic conquest. Every pig, every acre, every mill recorded and taxed. The English called it Domesday because there was no appeal from its judgments, like the biblical Day of Judgment. The book survives today, a written monument to England's enslavement. Saxon resistance continued for years, but was doomed from the start. Hereward the Wake held out in the Fen country, conducting guerrilla warfare from the marshes. When cornered, most of his men were killed, though legend says Hereward escaped. Edgar the Etheling, the last Saxon prince, fled to Scotland, returned with armies, was defeated, fled again, and eventually submitted. Some Saxon nobles fled to Constantinople, where they formed the Varangian Guard, preferring to serve the Byzantine emperor rather than live under Norman rule. Others went to Denmark, hoping to return with Viking armies. But with the entire Saxon leadership dead at Hastings, resistance was local, uncoordinated, and ultimately futile. By 1075, organized Saxon resistance was over. England was Norman. William didn't just conquer England's secular power, he replaced its religious hierarchy too. Within a decade, every Saxon bishop was dead, exiled or deposed, replaced by Normans. The last Saxon Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, was deposed in 1070. Norman bishops rebuilt England's churches in French Romanesque style, literally demolishing Saxon architecture. They introduced Latin practices that replaced English customs dating to Christianity's arrival. Even English saints were questioned. Norman clergy demanded proof of Saxon saints' miracles, delegitimizing English religious tradition. Monasteries were reformed, with Norman monks replacing English ones. The church, which should have protected English culture, became an instrument of cultural erasure. God, it seemed, now spoke French. Norman law replaced Saxon custom with brutal efficiency. The murdrum fine meant if a Norman was killed, the entire 100 district was fined, unless they could prove the victim was English. The forest laws made hunting in royal forests, 1/3 of England, punishable by blinding or death. The curfew, couvre-feu, French for cover fire, required all Saxons to extinguish fires and stay indoors after dark. Trial by combat replaced Saxon trial by jury or ordeal. French became the language of law courts. Saxon defendants often couldn't understand their own trials. The entire English legal tradition, developed over 500 years, was discarded for Norman feudalism. Justice became whatever Normans decided it was. The Saxon nobility's extinction at Hastings created one of history's forgotten diasporas. Thousands of Saxon warriors fled England rather than submit. Many went to Denmark and Norway, hoping to return with Scandinavian armies. Others travelled to the Mediterranean, offering their axes to anyone fighting Normans. The largest group, perhaps 5,000 warriors with families, sailed to Constantinople in 1075. The Byzantine emperor, delighted to recruit enemies of the Normans who were attacking his Italian territories, formed them into the English Company of the Varangian Guard. For 2 centuries, Byzantine emperors were protected by English exiles. Saxon England survived longer in Constantinople than in London. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, defenders included men still calling themselves English, though England had been Norman for 140 years. The scale of Norman dominance defies belief. In 1066, Normans numbered perhaps 10,000 in a population of 2 million, 0.5%, yet within a generation they owned everything. Every major landowner was Norman, every bishop was Norman, every sheriff, every judge, every castle commander was Norman. The 200 wealthiest people in England were all Norman. French was spoken in every hall of power, while 99% of the population spoke only English. This tiny minority maintained control through systematic violence, castle strongpoints, and the complete elimination of native leadership. No conquest in history has been so thorough with so few conquerors. The Normans didn't just defeat England, they performed a social decapitation that took centuries to heal. William the Bastard, now William the Conqueror, died in 1087 as violently as he had lived. While burning the French town of Mantes, his horse stepped on hot ashes, reared, and the saddle pommel ruptured William's intestines. He died in agony over 6 weeks, his stomach swelling with infection. At his funeral, his corpulent corpse wouldn't fit in the stone sarcophagus. When attendants tried to force it in, the body burst, filling the church with such a stench that mourners fled. The bastard who had conquered England in 9 hours couldn't even conquer death with dignity. But his bloodline would rule England for 900 years. Every English monarch since 1066 descends from William. The bastard son of a tanner's daughter became the ancestor of kings. The Bayeux Tapestry, our main visual source for Hastings, is actually Norman propaganda embroidered in thread. Commissioned by Bishop Odo, who fought at Hastings with a club, it shows Harold as an oathbreaker who deserved his fate. But careful examination reveals English hands subverting the Norman narrative. Harold is shown as noble and reluctant, William as aggressive. Small details suggest English seamstresses mocking their conquerors. The tapestry claims to show history, but actually shows history being rewritten by victors. Even the name lies. Hastings was fought at battle, not Hastings, but William preferred the grander name. Everything about the conquest, even its artistic record, involves Normans imposing their version of truth on English reality. The Norman conquest never really ended. It just evolved. The English absorption of Norman rulers took 3 centuries. It wasn't until Edward III, 1327 to 1377, that an English king spoke English as his first language. The British class system, with its assumption that posh accents indicate superiority, stems from Norman linguistic dominance. Even today, words of French origin sound educated: purchase, mansion, beef, while Saxon words sound common: buy, house, cow. The royal family still uses Norman French in Parliament. La reine remercie ses bons sujets. The conquest that took 9 hours created social divisions lasting 900 years. Modern England's inequality, its class obsessions, its cultural schizophrenia between European and insular identities, all born from arrows and axes on Senlac Hill. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, England was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom with 500 years of continuous culture, its own language, laws, and nobility. By that evening, it was the property of Norman French invaders who would systematically destroy every aspect of Saxon civilization. In 9 hours, William the Bastard had achieved what Vikings, Scots, and Welsh had failed to accomplish in centuries of trying. The completeness of his victory was unprecedented, not just winning a battle, but eliminating an entire ruling class. Perhaps 10,000 English died that day and in the immediate pursuit, but millions would suffer under Norman oppression for generations. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a military victory, but a cultural execution. William had conquered more than England. He had murdered its identity and replaced it with his own. The England that arose from this conquest would become a global empire, but Anglo-Saxon England died forever in those 9 hours. The bastard son of a tanner's daughter had killed a civilization before dinner, and his descendants would rule its corpse for nearly a millennium. Tentar novamente o Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.